Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us virtually today for an event marking the release of a new report on Sino-Russian military alignment. I'm Max Bergmann. I'm the director of the Eurasia Program here at CSIS. And today we have an excellent panel to discuss a new report that we have out on Sino-Russian military alignment. And we will also be discussing the future of Sino-Russian cooperation. Let me start by introducing our two excellent panelists who are both co-authors and contributed chapters to the report. First, my dear colleague, Brian Hart, is a fellow with the China Power Project here at the Center for Strategic International Studies, where he researches the evolving nature of Chinese power. His particular research interests include Chinese foreign and security policy, Chinese military modernization, and U.S.-China technological competition. And I'm also joined with Meia Nouwens, who is a senior fellow for Chinese security and defense policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. She leads IISS's research on China's digital Silk Road and was co-lead of the China Security Project with the Mercator Institute for China Studies. And prior to working at IISS, she worked for the European External Action Service as a policy officer in Taipei and as a trade analyst in the EU's delegation to New Zealand. Bonnie Lin, unfortunately, was unable to join us. But before I proceed, I also want to thank some of our other colleagues who helped contribute to this report. Andrew Lawson, who's a former fellow here on our Russia program, was co-editor of the volume, as well as Roxana Gabudulina, who did yeoman's work throughout the project, as well as the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS, Jude Blanchette and Sasha Chopanko. Both played a key role in helping the program and helping bring this report to fruition. Before turning to our panelists, let me just talk briefly about the report and maybe summarize some of its key findings. It's important to note the report began before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it analyzes literature from security scholars from Russia and China that were written before the war about their views on the relationship. However, most of the chapters of the report were written after the war had been launched in February. But much of the analysis focuses on the relationship where the relationship was pre-conflict. But I actually think this gives us a really good baseline to assess the relationship and to really assess what are the challenges and opportunities right now when we assess Sino-Russian relations. And I think one of the key features of the report that comes out in many of the chapters is that the China-Russia relationship really began to shift gears because of war, and frankly, because of Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And since then, the leadership of both China and Russia believe they have a mutual interest in working together to challenge what they perceive as a Western-dominated world designed to constrain their strategic interests. And the report focuses on four different, very specific areas: arms sales and technology transfers, military exercises, space and cyber warfare, and hybrid warfare and hybrid tactics. And overall, we found that Russia and China saw each other as increasingly important strategic partners. They both prioritized strengthening relations, which was, I think, vividly codified and symbolized at the Beijing Winter Olympics in February when China and Russia declared in a joint statement that this was a partnership with no limits. But, and I think there is a clear but, there was also a clear sense of lack of trust between the two countries, concern over potential transfers of technology and overall strategic intentions. We did find that there was a strategic triangle essentially emerging where strategic thinkers support on both sides in both Beijing and Moscow, support joint action to rebalance the strategic triangle between the United States, China, and Russia toward China and Russia. And this geopolitical rebalance will serve the state interests of both Russia and China, but will also limit what these thinkers view as the destabilizing influence of American-led Western hegemony. It's, I think, also important to note that one of the themes that comes through is a growing inequality in the relationship. This is largely due to China's growing strength. And so despite the kind of shared support for increasing relations, there's tension there too because of China's strength and Russia's concern about its weakness. When we looked at arms sales, Russia used to dominate this aspect of the relationship, but now finds itself roughly on equal footing with China. In fact, potentially competitors, given they are both competing for similar sales in the global market, especially when we look at lower and medium income countries. With military exercises over the last decade, Russia and China have increased the scale of their cooperation, and strategic thinkers on both sides believe this is the kind of military alignment that will continue. And I think it's important here that China may view that it has a lot to learn from Russia, what it's learning from the war in Ukraine and having to go up against Western weaponry. When it comes to space and cyber, another realm that we looked at, Russian and Chinese experts also saw that this was an area of converging alignment and avenues for technological cooperation. But there were also growing doubts on whether Russia would be able to really deliver on what it was potentially committing to. And I think those concerns will be especially true given the sanctions that have been in place since the war and Russia being very distracted by the conflict in Ukraine. Lastly, we looked at hybrid warfare. And I think here this will be of interest to our American and European friends, that both Russia and China view hybrid warfare and hybrid tactics as something being done against them. This is the so-called color revolutions as something that the West does to them, and that they see their hybrid responses against the West, interference in elections, seeking influence, as a way of responding to what they see as Western initiatives. And this was an area where there was potential for cooperation, particularly on population control, on monitoring of populations, but was still, I think, somewhat nascent in both Russia and China kind of still went their own way. With that, let me turn to Meia and ask her to sort of kick us off and to start and to really talk about her paper that she contributed to this edited volume, Sino-Russian Military Technological Cooperation, from Capability Gaps to Technology Partnership. And that's with a question. So let me turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. And I also want to echo my thanks to CSIS for including me in this project, and also, of course, to the work from the team kind of behind the scenes and getting all of this to the finish line as well. It's been really gratifying to work with you all on this. So I did indeed look at kind of the defense technological relationship between Russia and China from a Chinese perspective, looking at Chinese primary Chinese language sources on the matter from Chinese experts and analysts to kind of think about what how China views this relationship, both retrospectively and also moving forward as well. I think it's very clear that a few things jumped out at me. First of all, of course, that China's defense industry has, of course, developed over the last few decades, substantially becoming more indigenously capable and more advanced, or capable of producing advanced indigenous capabilities, and that there's now less and less a need for arms imports or arms transfers from the Russian defense technological and industrial base. Arms sales as a result of this have, of course, over time decreased significantly from Russia to China. And there's a real sense of pride in the Chinese literature on this, that China has somehow graduated from having this inferior position in the past and now is on a greater sense of equal footing. I note that in the past, the way that the Chinese authors that I looked at wrote about this, they noted a sense of deep historic chauvinism on Russia's engagement with China on defense technological transfers, and that China's now graduation in terms of defense technological industrial capabilities means that they can push back against that chauvinism a lot more. So both countries have now moved from a position of China being inferior and Russia being superior to one more of rough equality. However, that equality does not equate to trust in that relationship due to the ways in which China has reached that parity, perhaps, in defense technological capabilities. Noting in particular, interestingly, by Chinese experts, the mistrust from the Russian side stemming from China's perhaps past uses of Russian IP and reverse engineering practices, which they termed not in such strong words, but described as China's technologies having similar Russian genes in them, which I found a really poetic way of putting that. Nevertheless, so there's this mistrust. Both countries, however, still see, from the Chinese perspective at least, a utility in this bilateral relationship because it falls within the greater, wider context of great power competition with not just the United States, but the West in general. And so there is, from the Chinese literature, a sense that the two sides are moving from a one-sided procurement relationship now to slowly one of equal learning. So instead of just this being a transactional relationship in terms of arms sales, we're now moving to an era in the defense technological relationship between the two countries whereby there's joint R&D. And we've seen that, for example, with reports about the Russians and the Chinese working together to develop an advanced early warning system as well, amongst other things, of course. Nevertheless, as was noted in the introduction, this, of course, all predates some pretty major events that have impacted this bilateral relationship. And so the question, of course, is how long this relationship of equals would last. Now, we now know the answer, that it's a little more short-lived than we perhaps would have thought at the start of this writing this paper. And it's certainly now, I think, a more prominent issue. I wonder, however, moving forward, two key questions to maybe keep in mind and conduct further research on that I'll be looking at in the next year or so is, first of all, how China will now seek to leverage this new imbalance in the bilateral relationship with China now having a very much stronger position in the bilateral relationship. What will it seek to do with that relationship being weighted in its favor? And second of all, how will Beijing balance concerns about great power competition with concerns about potentially being at risk of secondary sanctions if it does continue to deepen it's now deepened bilateral defense technological relationship with Russia. I think those are things that don't necessarily have answers to yet. We've seen China be very cautious, I think, in its engagement with Russia so far since the war in Ukraine started. But perhaps that's something we could dig into a little bit more in the Q&A. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Let me turn it over to Brian, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll maybe shift to also looking forward about U.S. Russia-China relations, how it sort of responds to the war. I should also mention, which I forgot to, that if those in the audience would like to ask a question, I think you can do so on YouTube, and we will try to get to them. But Brian, let me turn it over to you.
Sure, and thanks for having me, and thanks to your team for organizing this event and for putting this report together. I think this is a really valuable new publication to be coming out at this time, given the state of the China-Russia relationship. So I really commend you all in putting this together. So Bonnie Lin Bonnie Lin is on our team. She's the head of the China Power Project here at CSIS. So she and I wrote on specifically China-Russia military exercises, looking at what Chinese scholars mostly are saying about this. And so we relied mostly on Chinese think tanks, experts, and academics, but we also relied quite a bit in this on one important source, which is the Science of Military Strategy, which is an important PLA document and textbook that's used by those at China's defense universities. So that kind of popped up over and over throughout this report. But I'll just kind of summarize some of our findings and then touch on the implications. So we really thought about this as we read, all of these different sources. We kind of saw four major themes emerging, and we kind of touched on each of these. The first of those is China's desire to gain military experience from this. So if you think about China's military, they haven't been engaged in a large scale conflict in over 40 years. And so this is a constant refrain that you see in PLA sources talking about the need to gain experience and to find new opportunities to practice military operations to prepare for war. And so that is a big part of what drives China's interest in these exercises. And they've really, I think, as a result of that, the nature and the types of exercises that China and Russia engage in has really expanded over the years. We've mapped this out in graphs on our website. And so if you look at this, it really grew from the first exercise in 2003 to, in some recent years, up to 10 or more exercises in a given year. And those have taken a lot of different forms. They've grown from, in the early years, largely being ground-based exercises focused on anti-terrorism, to now there are, repeated joint naval exercises, aerial patrols. So you really see, them widening the aperture of their experiences here. And I think that's an important point for the Chinese side. And increasingly, the Chinese experts have talked about this, as Max and Meia have noted. The shifting balance of power here is kind of reflected in this, with China increasingly thinking about these exercises not from a junior position, but from a more co-equal and perhaps even a senior position. And Chinese scholars repeatedly spoke specifically about one exercise in 2021, which is called ZIPAD Interaction 2021, which I'm sure the Russians have spoken about some as well. But the Chinese really spoke about that as being one of the first times that they've hosted a major exercise and really led it from a more senior position. And they even spoke about that being a part of them building their own military brand as a part of these exercises. So I think that one has emerged as an important one. And we see, it'll be interesting to see if we see increased cooperation along those lines going forward. The next area we looked at was the role of these exercises in deterring the United States and its allies. So one of the interesting things about almost every major military exercise China holds, you will see an official statement that these exercises don't target third parties. They're not politically driven. But if you look at what the experts are saying, that's exactly the opposite of what's true. So even China's textbook on the science of military strategy outright says that exercises between both bilateral and multilateral exercises are aimed at strategic deterrence. They're aimed at creating skepticism in the mind of their adversaries about what their intentions are, whether they'll eventually turn this into something bigger than an exercise, or there's a real psychological component there that they see. And we've seen specifically experts talking about the role of some of these exercises as being specifically targeting Japan and the United States. And I would just flag one of these, the most telling example lately is the Meia aerial patrol that we saw when the Quad leaders were meeting in Japan, and China and Russia decided to have an aerial patrol that went between the strait between Japan and South Korea, both countries of which had to scramble jets to kind of trail these Russian and Chinese aircraft. So that was a very clear use of these exercises for political targeting. And I think we're likely, one of the things that we say is, I think we're likely to probably see even more of that going forward. Last 2 points is, I think another important part from China's view is that these play a role in shoring up regional security and stability. So you all touched on some of the color revolutions that are in the minds of, I think, both China and Russia. And if you think about a lot of these exercises taking place through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization within Central Asia, a lot of them are focused on anti-terrorism exercises. And so that's an important way for, I think, both China and Russia to reassure some of the countries in Central Asia and to help them shore up their security resilience. And I think that's another important part of this is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's been a really big platform for them to engage on these. And finally, we looked at how this just supports the broader China-Russia relationship. You see them speaking about how they've actually, both sides have, or especially the Russian side has used these exercises to show off some of their equipment that they might try to sell to China. And so that's been a way for Russia on its side to do that, and China looks at these as an opportunity to maybe enhance a little bit of the trust between the two sides. As I think we'll discuss deeper, there is a lack of trust on some of these issues between the two sides, and so theoretically, joint military exercises can play a role in kind of some of these people-to-people exchanges on the military front. So just wrapping that all together, one of the things that I think is an open question to me is, in the medium to long term, as the war in Ukraine goes on, as Russia expends more resources, will we see that being a major problem for broader China-Russia military cooperation, but the exercises in general? So we actually did see, I think in maybe August or September, there was a large exercise in Eastern Russia where China joined. But the reporting was that military exercise was significantly scaled down from the past, and some estimating that was due to Russia being strained with the war in Ukraine. So that's an interesting dynamic. Will we see more of that, and how will China react to that? I think those are all really interesting dynamics that we'll be watching going forward. So I'll leave it there, but I'm looking forward to questions.
Great. No, thanks, Brian. And let me maybe stick with you with the first question. The exercises seem to me to be an area where this is something Russia brings to the table in the relationship, where China has something to gain from learning about from Russia, from its military experience. Now, right now, we are sort of used to degrading the Russian military given its performance in Ukraine, but it has now experience operating in Syria, experience operating war in Georgia. It is now operating against Western equipment. In your interpretation of these exercises from the Chinese perspective, is this something that the Chinese really value and are eager to kind of continue going forward?
Yeah, so that was actually one of the more interesting things that we looked into. There was one Chinese scholar spoke pretty openly about some of the limitations that they see actually on the Russian side, and that this was before the most recent invasion of Ukraine. And they spoke openly about, while the main benefit that Russia has, of course, is that it has been engaged in multiple operations. And so they see Russian battalions having a lot of experience in terms of conflict, but the Chinese sources emphasize that a lot of that experience has been focused on the kinds of operations that they're doing in Ukraine, that they have been doing in Ukraine since 2014. And so some of the Chinese scholars actually disparaged the Russian forces a little bit, saying that that experience and those applications might not apply to some other scenarios. So there was that bit of, I think, interesting critique. They also very openly critiqued some of the Russian military equipment, and noting that by and large, a lot of the Chinese equipment now is a lot more modern than Russian equipment. And so that's an interesting dynamic. And I think it's pretty clear that that's only going to become more of the case as China, I think, continues to advance its indigenous development of equipment. And as Russia, I am not a Russian expert, but I think, there's clear signs that these, protracted wars have been a strain on Russia's, defense industry, and also the sanctions placed on Russia. So that's an interesting dynamic. I think the Chinese do still see some benefit in gaining experience and learning from the Russians, but I think they're increasingly skeptical of the overall value. So I think these exercises continue, and China sees them as useful. But I personally think that for China, increasingly the value is at the strategic and kind of deterrent level, to focus these exercises, especially on responding to U.S. actions and to deterring the United States and its allies. So, yeah, I think that's another interesting thing that we'll watch going forward.
Into Meia, I want to sort of a similar question for you, because it seems like the arms sales security cooperation or potential technology transfer of major weapon systems like Russian air defense, Russian fighter jets, other technology that was sort of a key part, arms sales were sort of a key part of Sino-Russian relations. And that, China has modernized its military, and I could see a lot of Russian reticence, to proceed with arms sales when you know that China will seek to take them apart and essentially replicate them. You noted that the Russians sort of speak proudly of some of China's weapon systems having Russian genes. I mean, some of the Chinese weapon systems have American genes as well. But I guess from a Chinese perspective, are they concerned about that reputational cost, about essentially by having sort of violated some technological trust in the past, presumably that they would give certain assurances to maintain the technological flow, or is China sort of quite comfortable with its kind of the current state of the relationship there, and not necessarily needing more Russian equipment?
I think there are areas that I think these are like to haves, but not necessarily must haves in terms of what we still think China could leverage from the Russian defense industry. I mean, certainly the most advanced types of Russian aircraft engines might be of use. On the other hand, we've seen, for example, the J-20s now being converted to using Chinese indigenous aircraft engines. So, I really wondered to what extent there is an absolute need for this technology rather than, it's great if they could get their hands on it. So, I mean, one thing to look forward to, I guess, I suppose, is how desperate the Russians would be for financial motivation to actually give up its last crown jewels to the Chinese. I mean, they've been very hesitant with things like air defense systems in the past, and then jointly, developing an early warning system and something else. But it all goes to, is Russia still able to export at a large rate in order to finance its defense industry? And if it's not, then what are its options here? And how much reputational damage is it willing to just accept as a consequence of the war in Ukraine in this bilateral relationship? Because I would imagine, I'm not a Russia expert, but I imagine it would be a pretty big psychological blow to just, at the end of the day, have to admit that the Chinese are in a stronger position, technologically speaking, after a long history of that not being the case.
Yeah, I think one of the major challenges when we talk about a relationship based on arms sales or arms sales cooperation is that if both countries have a vibrant arms sales industry, they're inherent competitors as well. And, the United States sees that with our relations with France, where we are competing for arms sales globally. And European countries themselves, when they try to do joint defense projects, such as the Future Combat Air System or something like that, that involves a number of countries, there's all sorts of concerns about basically supporting your competitor. And so with that, I think when I sort of look forward at the kind of global arms sales trade, where many of Russia's arms sales go to lower and middle income countries, particularly in Africa, where the inability of Russia perhaps to export the same level of arms because they're going to be needed for this war will create huge market opportunities potentially for the Chinese. Is that something that you are seeing in China, that there is sort of discussion of or thinking about how to take advantage right now of potential Russian weakness, where in some ways this relationship that we're trying to build, well, now there's this real potential for antagonism?
Look, to be honest, I haven't seen that discussed yet. That level of Schadenfreude, I think, is probably not at the top of the minds at the moment. I think Russia's performance in Ukraine and Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine has caused plenty of problems, I think, for China, and challenges moving forward. So I'm not sure if the glee about perhaps taking Russia's share of defense exports markets is at the top of the mind at the moment. I would say, of course, that the two defense industries are in a very different place. Russia needs to export arms and sell arms in order to drive modernization and continued investment in its defense industry. China's defense industry doesn't really need that. So again, this is a maybe nice to have. On the other hand, I think there is a limit to what China at the moment is willing to export in terms of, how much of its most advanced equipment it wants to keep for its own use and not export. So definitely not something that I've seen just yet, but something to keep an eye on. especially after the last Zhuhai air show, of course, as well, which was fascinating.
Actually, maybe you could pick up on that point a little bit and maybe talk about the last July air show.
Sure. I mean, so again, saw advancements in their air-to-air missile capabilities, which is perhaps not entirely surprising. I think that's been an ongoing story. The perhaps most surprising thing that I saw were some UAVs and new versions and variants of UAVs that I hadn't seen before and weren't necessarily on my radar. Whether or not those are already for export, I think is doubtful, and certainly a lot of them are mock-ups and not yet just real capabilities. But I think it's an interesting trend towards that unmanned or uncrewed capability that the PLA is, or at least Chinese defense industry is focusing on more and more.
So, Brian, back to you on exercises. You know, part of the purpose of military exercises is that they send a real symbolic message about a growing partnership, about the strength of relations, and that, you know, if two countries are willing to do military exercises together, it demonstrates the closest of that bond, and they're willing to trust each other with essentially with how, sharing how each other's militaries operate. Given the kind of weak turnout, essentially, of Russia in some of the exercises this year, and also the potential reputational cost, perhaps from the Chinese, do you think that this military exercises could be an area of cooperation that essentially begins to fade, or we've maybe hit the high water mark, and that we could be in a downslope here where there's less focus on that?
It's a good question, and we touch on this a little bit at the end of our piece. I think rather than fade, I think they're likely to evolve more. One of the things we point out is if Russia is drained militarily due to the war, in the medium or even long term, one of the things that we might see is continued scaled down exercises. So before the war, you had these very large exercises. I believe the Vostok 2018 games were some 300,000 troops total, which is a huge number of troops for an exercise. And so we're not seeing that yet. It looks like things have been downsized, at least for now. Whether that remains a permanent fixture is unclear. What I do expect is for China to increasingly take the lead. And if you take the lead in terms of organizing, hosting, and I think planning these exercises. Because if you look at what these Chinese experts are saying, they're very excited by the prospect of actually now being in a place to do that, to be able to at least be on an equal footing with Russia, if not in a more advanced footing. And so I think that is something that we're likely to see. We're likely to see perhaps China in the driver's seat a bit more in terms of deciding where these exercises will take place and in what scenarios. So one thing that would I think be extremely escalatory that we haven't seen in the past is we haven't really seen Russia agree to engage in exercises near the Taiwan Strait so much. So if you look back to one of the first exercises that they held in 2005, there was initially a request by the Chinese side to put them closer to the Taiwan Strait. And the reporting is that the Russian side pushed away from that. And so they ended up holding the exercises, I believe, in Shandong province, which is much farther north of the Taiwan Strait. So one interesting dynamic, I don't expect to see this, in the near future, but in the long term, if China really is in the driver's seat, will we see Russia being willing to engage in some bilateral or even multilateral exercises closer to the Taiwan Strait as a tool for deterrence? And that would be I think, an interesting shift. And so that's something I would look to watch for. But by and large, I think we're, again, likely to see perhaps some more scaled down versions, at least from the Russian side. And I think you can still make very pointed send very pointed deterrent signals with even limited exercises. Point in case being the Meia aerial bomber patrol near, that took place during the Tokyo Quad Summit. So I think if you think about that, I think those are the kinds of more pointed exercises they're likely to engage in going forward. And so that's more or less what I see. And I wouldn't necessarily consider that a scaling back, just an evolution in terms of how their power dynamics are evolving.
And maybe a question for both of you about what would China seek to learn from Russia about the war in Ukraine. Brian, you had mentioned that the Chinese sort of thought that Russia previously was sort of overly focused on events in Ukraine, and that it wasn't as relevant to Chinese strategic concerns. However, I think the current war is of a totally different nature. There's use of massive Western weaponry, and one of the things that we have noticed is that we get Iranian drones will fall into Ukrainian hands and then be dissected by think tank members and various governments. And so we are getting to see what advanced Russian weaponry and Russian missiles, what chips are in them. But some of the weaponry that is being provided to Ukraine, some of that is also going astray. That was a major concern when I was in the U.S. government about, especially in 2014 and 15, about providing Ukraine with potentially technologically advanced systems, where a military that was seen as potentially penetrated by Russian intelligence. So I would think that the Russians might have something here to essentially trade, or some knowledge or intel or information that the Chinese might find interesting. Do you think that there's a desire in China to kind of learn about the employment of Western weaponry, some of the lessons that learned that the Russians are facing in this conflict, and perhaps other technological areas where the Russians might have some information that Chinese might be interested in? Is that something? And I would think the Russians would want to trade that information effectively, but would that be of interest to China? Brian, maybe I'll start with you and then to Meia.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I'll start off by saying that one of the things that we know for sure is that the PLA is watching the war in Ukraine very closely. We know that the PLA and their scholars have watched past conflicts very closely. One of the things that helped to kickstart their own modernization drive was just how successful the U.S. kind of what they call intelligentized warfare, smart weaponry, how that went in the Gulf War. They took a lot of lessons from that and saw how effective it was for the United States, and they tried to incorporate that into their own modernization efforts. And so I think we're certainly likely to see PLA scholars watching this conflict. You raise an interesting point about whether the Chinese would want, some of this intelligence. I'm sure that Beijing wants intelligence, both intelligence that they collect on their own, but also hoping that Russia shares some of that intelligence. But I think an interesting issue is, I'm not a Russia expert, so I'd be interested in what Russia would be willing to share with the Chinese, just because of there is an undercurrent of distrust that kind of permeates the military relationship, both from, I think, really, we've kind of mapped this out a bit. You can look at just how many cases there have been of at least in the public space, of Chinese espionage of Russian equipment, not just copying it, but also stealing it and using Russian assets to steal technology. So I think that my guess is that the Russian side will have a bit of hesitance of sharing really important information, partly because it might also reveal their own weaknesses, which they don't want China to know. So that's a really interesting question, and I wish I knew the answer to it. So I'd be interested in seeing what Meia thinks about that.
No, I actually fully agree, Brian. I think that part about not revealing weaknesses is incredibly important. And I think that also has played a role in how we've seen China conduct some of its exercises as well around Taiwan, not to either give room for misinterpretation or miscalculation, but also to not necessarily show the capabilities that it perhaps is not fully confident in as well. So I think that counts for China as much as it does for Russia. Of course, on China's side around those post-Pelosi exercises, I wouldn't say that's necessarily aimed at Russia, watching Chinese capabilities. But I think that type of calculation certainly likely does play a role in this. But I think there are all kinds of things that China, of course, can learn from this without that type of bilateral intelligence sharing that the PLA will be taking away from this. And I think key points that I think they'll be taking away are things about, basic things like maintenance and logistics. But the PLA has been working on that for a long time. And again, it wouldn't be exactly the same type of scenario. Where I think there is greater crossover is areas in terms of things like information dominance, use of electronic warfare, the use of cyber and space capabilities as well. And not just how China would do that, but of course also how the West has been able to do that using the private sector as well. So I think those types of lessons, that public-private, like military and private collaboration, how that would work, I think has also been probably will have been interesting for the PLA to watch.
No, thank you both. Not to sort of answer my own question, but I mean, my take right now is I think the Russians would be quite willing, I think, to trade information gleaned from the war, especially if it's involving Western weaponry, in part because there's a shared mutual adversary in the United States and the West, but also because they are desperate for Chinese help and cooperation. When you see the Russians turning to the North Koreans for artillery, or at least reportedly. And so I think this brings us to a sort of shifting to focus kind of on a bit more of the present. There's been some questions in the chat about Chinese attitudes in cooperation with Russia since February, since the war. I think the Russians are in real need for assistance. They need weapons. Now they still have a defense industry that is able to produce, but they are, subject of massive sanctions and export controls. I'm curious for both of your take on China's posture toward Russia. Why hasn't China done more? This was a partnership with no limits. Russia is now in a war that they view as existential. They are seeking support and help, and China appears very reticent, at least, to allow to violate sanctions, to provide any arms or weaponry. Why is that the case? Meia, maybe I'll start with you.
I think the simple answer is that a partnership without limits isn't an alliance, and that China does not act in anybody's interest but its own. So I'll fine to say that you have a partnership without limits, but words can be pretty shallow at the end of the day when national interest is at stake. And here, once again, having a whole host of problems domestically to take care of, not least the economy, due to, in part, structural issues and dynamic zero COVID policies, having gone through a few years already throughout the pandemic of an increasingly critical international and external environment for China, instability on its borders with Afghanistan, all at the culmination of a politically important year for President Xi and the party. I really don't see how that limitless relationship would have stayed limitless for very long, to be honest, in this context. And certainly, a real important point here was that warning of the application of secondary sanctions on China if it did overstep this into the bilateral relationship with Russia, and overstep some of those sanctions in terms of helping the Russians with core components or with military equipment. I think that message was received. Question is, would they think about ways to circumvent that? Would they think of ways to still help and not help so obviously? I think those are things to look at in the future.
Brian, curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, since February, China has really tried to walk a very thin line on Russia and to reassure, I think, Moscow. We saw some of the strongest statements I saw on the Chinese side were in September when Li Jianshu, who was at the time China's number 3 person and head of their National People's Congress, went to Moscow and spoke and very firmly put the Ukraine war on the blame of NATO and the United States, and spoke in support of Russia's claims there, or not their territorial claims, but just Russia's stance on Ukraine. And so, but a week or so later, Xi Jinping was meeting with Putin for the first time since the war, and the meeting wasn't this warm, glowing meeting that I think we saw perhaps in February before the war started. And that was partly because the war in Ukraine was going so poorly for Russia at the time, with their major retreats into eastern Ukraine. So I think this relationship, they say, has no limits, but I think there are pretty clear limits on what the relationship is, and how far Beijing is willing to go to risk blowback directly. But I'll just add that I don't know that that's necessarily an overall weakness of the relationship. It is on certain issues, but by and large, I think Beijing and Moscow view the relationship similarly, and they really don't want this to be the kind of formal alliance that the United States has that can impose real costs in order to maintain it. And we saw in the 1950s the Sino-Soviet alliance collapse disastrously because both sides had ideological differences, and they weren't willing to adhere to the treaty that they'd set out. And so I think we see Chinese scholars saying that it's actually stronger and better for China if the two can have a relationship that is built on mutual interest, especially opposing the United States, while realizing that they can't agree on everything and they can't be aligned on everything. So I think the kind of fluidity and flexibility of the relationship, they see it as a strength, not necessarily weakness.
So we'll go to some questions from the chat, and as many are coming in. But let me just say, I sort of take both of your points that this was, China was sort of assessing its strategic interest. But I think in some ways this demonstrates why Russia, I think, was well-founded to have a lack of trust in this potential relationship, where here is a massive conflict that Russia is essentially tells China that it is fighting the West, fighting NATO. And there's a real lack of support that comes forward. Yes, Brian, there's, some verbal words of encouragement for Russia, perhaps, but not the kind of cold, hard military equipment that it might need. Let me go to, there's a question from Andy Zelicki, apologies if I mispronounce your name, asking, what are the odds of a no-limit partnership progressing to a formal alliance within the next 5 years? And I think my answer would be fairly low, given that this would be the moment where I think we would see it come closer together. But just want to survey both of you to see, do you think that this relationship, maybe if it's not a formal alliance, could get closer in the coming years?
I guess I can jump in there. I think this partly connects to what I was saying earlier. Is I don't think that the two sides feel they need to have a formal alliance yet, and feel that they have more flexibility without that kind of added weight to it. I will say, to me, Russia-China, convergence and alignment so far has been very heavily driven by perceptions of threat from the United States and its allies. And so that's the main variable that determines I think the trajectory of their relationship. There's a baseline for why they need to have a stable relationship, but the strengthening of the relationship is largely driven by these threat perceptions. So if China and Russia both do feel increasingly growing threats from the United States and the West, then I think we will see more alignment. And I don't think that they will feel that they have any other choice, because Russia is by far China's most powerful partner. It's the only large major country that's really been willing to be convergent on a lot of these issues. And so they won't have any choice in terms of competing with the United States other than to continue to strengthen those relationships. If tensions between the US and China do ease, which I don't see happening really, I think that you'll see maybe perhaps a cooling of that relationship out of strategic need. But by and large, I think we're likely to continue to see pretty strong convergence.
And let me turn over to Meia, but let me just also add another question in from the chat that raises the question of whether Russia's poor military performance might prompt China to go a different direction than Brian mentioned, that to sort of distance itself a bit more from Russia.
Yeah, it's I agree with Brian. I guess my question would be, if Russia continues on the trajectory that it's on now, and we see a Russia that becomes increasingly weaker and, oh, I'm sorry, my camera's gone out of focus, becomes increasingly weaker and technologically less useful and economically weaker as well, then what would the purpose of that alliance be? Then you could just keep it at a relationship, at a stronger, deeper partnership, whatever you want to call it. But would you then, as Beijing, really see value in formalizing an alliance in which you then might have to support Russian interests rather than your. I just find it difficult to think of a circumstance in which I can see that. Now, if Russia were to rebound from this and become a more useful partner in these three different ways, and as Brian noted, the general context of Western and then competition with the West as a bloc becomes more pronounced, then I could potentially see in the longer term an alliance actually forming. But the current trajectory you're on, I'm not really that sure. Not convinced.
Well, we have a question for you, Meia, in the chat from Paul Schwartz, who also contributed an excellent chapter, the Russian perspective on military exercises. But he wants to ask you, Meia, do you see joint military R&D between Russia and China as a potential growth area that could possibly fly under the sanctions radar while benefiting both sides?
It could. I suppose that it could fall under the sanctions radar. Would it benefit both sides? I think it might benefit China. And one thing that I'm going to be looking at in a project over the next year is the talent transfer out of Russia and potentially either to China or in ways that is useful to Chinese defense industry. Because I think that's where an opportunity may lie for the Chinese, not necessarily in hard technologies, but in this R&D space. So this type of collaboration might deepen, but again, my question would be useful in the long term, and how long term? I mean, we've heard collaboration, this collaboration on, for example, the early warning system being it was announced years ago. There's very little public, I think, unclassified sense of where that project, that R&D project, is at the moment and how advanced it is. So I guess for the short-term benefit to Russia, this would be of a longer-term trajectory than a shorter-term return.
There's another question in the chat about Central Asia, and given that Russia is basically pulling its forces from all over and sending them to Ukraine, and this is perhaps leading to a potential security vacuum. In January, Russia actually sent forces into Kazakhstan. They have bases in the region and have had to draw some of the forces from those. Do you see that China might seek to take advantage, perhaps, of the security vacuum and play a greater role in Central Asia? Do you see a potential tension there between with Russia if China plays an increasingly important role? Brian, maybe to start with you.
Sure. I think this is a really interesting question, and I think there for a long time there's been this theory that China and Russia have been able to cooperate in Central Asia because they provide different things. You have Russia providing security, cooperation and security assurances, while you have China really increasingly filling that economic role. And I think we are starting to see very, minor signs that is shifting a little bit, with China, of course, continuing to play the economic role in the region while also stepping up its security footprint a bit in the region. So I think the central question is, how much of that is Russia willing to allow? I mean, this is a region that they have historically been, very dominant in, and have a long historical, legacy in. And so, for me, knowing what I know about Russia, I do think that Moscow is going to bristle at that a little bit if China acutely oversteps its bounds. So I think for right now, China's been playing it pretty smart by trying to make steady gains on the economic and on the security side in the region, but not doing it in ways that they know are going to necessarily anger Moscow. As the power dynamic shifts increasingly in China's favor, how long will that be true? How long will China be willing to, let another major power shape the region? How long will they be willing to not dictate terms in the region as much? So I think that's a long-term question, and I think it's very much still up in the air as to how that's going to go. So far, I think they've done a pretty good job of managing competition, but I think that could change with the shifting dynamics in the region.
With just a few minutes left, maybe one final question to both of you to sort of put in sort of a hypothetical crystal ball. Let's say the war continues to go badly for Russia. It becomes quite dire for Russian forces over the next year. And then there's an effort to engage Beijing in saying, we need your support, we need your help. If not, this is going to be a catastrophe for us, and it could potentially upset the stability of the regime in the Kremlin. Do you think there's a way, or could you see an avenue for China to reverse itself on sanctions, to start providing Russia with more economic assistance, absorb the blow of secondary sanctions, start providing military equipment, essentially reverse where it's currently standing and become a participant in this war, and similar to how the West is being a participant in the war vis-a-vis Ukraine? Do you envision a potential scenario in which that might be possible, or is that something that is off the table? Meia, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Sure. So I think that entirely depends on what the Chinese economy looks like at that moment, and also, assuming that great power competition and rivalry is ongoing, and as it is now, what the state of the Chinese economy is, what dual circulation looks like, and whether or not that has actually become a success at that time, and also, more importantly, whether China's efforts to sanction-proof its economy have succeeded or made any progress. And particular weaknesses here are in the financial sector. So whether or not China has created alternatives that are widely used for things like SWIFT, or internationalize the renminbi. I mean, all of these things need to happen before it can just decide to not care about the implications of potential secondary sanctions. So that's what I would be watching for as a stepping stone to whether or not it would take that decision.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Meia on the point of where the Chinese economy is at, because I think Beijing's going to be really reluctant to risk sanctions blowback, especially if the economy is not doing well, which it very much is not doing right now. So I think that's a key factor. I think one thing I'd point out is I don't think China wanted this war to happen anyway. And once it did, I think they really wanted the Russians to win quickly and to not drag this out, because they see it as weakening their partner and in causing long-term stability, especially economic instability for China. So I don't think that they wanted this, and I think they really are hoping that it will wrap up one way or the other. So if you do see Russia in an increasingly desperate situation, my guess is China would probably ramp up diplomatic efforts to try to intervene in some way, if to not broker a deal, which I don't know that they're in a place to do that. And we haven't seen them. We saw some language around that early on in the war, but not really any concrete steps in terms of China intervening to resolve this. But you might see some stepped up diplomatic pressure put on Moscow and put on both sides to try to bring this to the end. Besides that, I think Beijing's going to be really hesitant to put its neck out over the line and risk really significant blowback.
Great. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Meia. It is, I think it was a really interesting conversation. Thank you all for joining us for the hour. The report is Understanding the Broader Transatlantic Security Implications of Greater Sino-Russian Military Alignment. It's available for free on the CSIS website. You too can download it and read it today. I want to really thank our guests today. I want to thank all of you for attending, and also thank all those that participated in helping bring the report together, who contributed. It was a team effort, and I think provides a really interesting baseline for us to assess Sino-Russian relations going forward. So thank you so much, and hope you have a great rest of your day.